So this topic has been a lot of fun. I've been reading and researching and watching the PBS documentary and finding every little nerdy thing I can about Louisa May Alcott and trying to go it much like Allison did, trying to see what is the nugget that really shows through. And I think about the wonder of a person who, despite everything that was thrown at her, just kept on going with this fiery impulse to make a difference. And so she was born on November 29th, 1832, and she was a magnificent woman who grew up among literary giants and thinkers, and she was raised in the heart of Transcendentalism, a movement and philosophy which turned Unitarianism and even America on its head. You know, that little group of people had such a huge impact on our own faith tradition and also on America and literature and the world. So what exactly defines Transcendentalism? Writing in the Dial, which was a Transcendentalist publication at the time, the journalist J.A. Saxton summed up Transcendentalist experience as the classic American experience. He observed that the very existence of the United States is transcendental. His right to be a nation was broadly and unequivocally, that's a hard word to say, legitimated upon the instinctive truth of the principle of the equality and brotherhood of universal man. Now, looking back on that, who was listed there? Universal man. And who was that? That was white man with property. But that's okay. This is that spirit of rugged individualism is absolutely the Transcendentalist experience. And what's really cool is that Louisa May Alcott says it's not only the man's experience, it's everybody's experience. It's women, it's children, and I think if she had lived in this time, she would say, regardless of gender identity, it's everybody's experience. Ralph Waldo Emerson spoke about the excitement of the Transcendentalist movement flowering in its promise for a new world. He said, "No one in 1840 can converse much without remarking upon the progress of a revolution, even as the spirit of its time is felt by every individual with some difference." And Ralph Waldo Emerson was a Unitarian minister initially, and he was so disenchanted with the idea of finding truth in a book or in some doctrine. He basically went to the Harvard Divinity School address and said, "You guys are you're not doing anything. What is the church for? You're just preaching old stuff. Go out into the world. Make a difference. You're the frozen chosen." And he really made a lot of the old Unitarian ministers really mad. And it was all over the papers how he had called to question the purpose of church, the purpose of Scripture. And he said, you know, we have the inherent ability to discern what is true. We have the ability to have our own relationship with the divine. And in fact, we are all divine, and everything around us is sacred and divine. And that's a totally different experience of dominating the world, or that we are inherently unworthy sinners. You know, it's a very different mindset. And so Transcendentalism, to this little girl, Louisa May Alcott, you know, she had a rough time, and I'll talk about that a little bit, but she was told basically that her mind could matter, and that her thoughts could matter, and that she didn't need some priest or some book to tell her what was true. And that's revolutionary, especially in that time. And the time period of American Transcendentalism was between the mid-1830s and the 1840s. Most of them were young Unitarian Boston ministers. And the word itself came from the Critique of Pure Reason by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. He had it in the first part of his book, Transcendental Doctrine of Elements, which centers on the sources of human knowledge. He argued that we cannot know things that are sensed through space and time. We can never really know that they exist in themselves. And so his argument went on to say that it is impossible to know the existence of God. It's got to be a leap of faith to acknowledge the existence of deity. And so he had the definition of transcendental reality that things exist in and of themselves, and that our relationship to them matters. And so Emerson had even more trust in the ability of human beings than Kant. He said that humans can intuitively understand God through direct experience, and he really focused on the innate sacredness of the individual. And so to know things through the doctrine of self-reliance, which is an essay that he wrote, he said, a person cannot discover religious truth through tradition, ritual books, or priest. Action and attitude are more closely related to get to know God than in religious sentiment. And so what happened in this little magical corner of Boston was the Transcendentalists gathered at Emerson's house, and it included women. You had women like Margaret Fuller and Elizabeth Peabody, and Bronson Alcott was a part of this circle. He was kind of the charity case often of this circle, and I'll go into that. But they would have what they called the Transcendentalist Club. They would have conversations about items of the day, and the fact that women were included was, unheard of. And in fact, the reporter and secretary was Margaret Fuller, and eventually Elizabeth Peabody. And Margaret Fuller was a journalist in her own right. She went on to have her own lover, and then got married out in Europe. Unfortunately, she died young, but she was also an example that Louisa May looked at and thought, wow, people make their own way. Louisa was the daughter of Transcendentalist Bronson Alcott, and she grew up in the company of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Theodore Parker, and a young Henry David Thoreau. And they spent most of their lives going back and forth between Boston and Concord, often depending on friends and to lend them food and shelter and help to make it. Their family would not use anything that had slave or child labor, so no cotton, no silk, no wool. And so they wore linen in Boston, Massachusetts. So you can expect that they were very cold. And some of the idealism of the Alcott family had its own price, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Bronson Alcott's wife was Abba May, and she was the sister of the Unitarian minister Samuel May. You can see all these these circles of relationships. And she thought that her husband was a great thinker, a moral exemplar, and begged for money so that he could continue his intellectual pursuits. So he was busy, thinking and doing whatever he was doing. And just like in Little Women, Abba May was trying to feed her family and to run a household and to raise these little girls. And Louisa's education was largely under the direction of her father, and he had formed the Temple School, which was really innovative at the time. Unitarians had a more positive view of human nature. During the 1800s, it was thought that children should be seen, not heard. They should sit in harsh little chairs, and sometimes you would hear about people even like tying pupils to chairs to read books, and just really harsh realities. Whereas Bronson Alcott talked about having conversations with kids, kind of like Socrates, and learning through conversation and thought. And instead of thinking people were born sinners and broken, he thought that that you train the child's will rather than breaking it. people of the time wrote a lot about children and their potential, which was a lot different. It was more, it's that potential of human nature. And that's where that transcendentalist thought was, that we have worth. Even children, back then, children and women were property. They could be treated however. But transcendentalists thought that within children lay the seeds of perfection, like an unopened bud of a plant. And therefore, adults should encourage, not suppress, the natural impulses of children. At Temple School, Bronson opposed whipping students. He encouraged people to talk about their experiences rather than lecturing. And what's really fun is Louisa was actually a runner. And, women did not run in that. But she actually is quoted as saying that she must have been a deer or a horse in a previous life, because running brought her so much joy. And if you've read or seen the movie of Little Women, the girls are running around, throwing snowballs, having a good time, and all the adults are like, oh, they're not acting like proper women, and the mother's like, good, good for you, and just really enjoying life. And when she was 13 years old, she wrote in her journal that she had a spiritual experience while running, and she felt his presence. So it must have been how she felt God in running. Now, her father, Brunson Alcott, had really good ideas, but also some really strange ones. He created a utopian community called Fruitlands that only lasted 8 months. He had a nudist there, which, whatever, I don't care. But he told the nudist that he had to wear clothes, a sheet during the day, but he could be a nudist at night. There were rules for the community. They could not eat certain kinds of foods, like no root plants. They had to, all the couples had to be celibate, and his wife was not very happy about that. And they had all these strange rules, like a lot of utopian communities, they can just kind of go off the rails. And so he really thought that this was the pure way to become something, I don't know. After 8 months, though, his wife, again, said, well, I'm taking the girls. And if you want to stay, that's fine. But unfortunately, this experiment really cemented in the mind of Louisa May Alcott that she could not trust her father to support the family. And there were 4 children. Her mom had not the best health. Her father was often in his books and away and trying to earn money, not very successfully. And so it was to Louisa, who thought that she could save her family. And she had a disappointment with her father. She was really close with her mom, and her father would do experiments on the children, not beat them, but like many people do, but he would try and encourage them by, if I put an apple, or he would put an apple in like this little 2-year-old's room and say, don't eat the apple. Don't eat the apple, that's wrong, because other people are hungry and we're gonna give it to someone else. And they would leave the apple in the room, and her sister would not eat the apple. But Louisa was passionate, and she ate the apple. And her father would emotionally say, well, that's very wrong, Louisa. I'm very disappointed in you that you ate the apple. And he would create these temptations and these experiments that we would now look at as emotional abuse. And so, sometimes intellectualism isn't the best tool for parenting, apparently. So these are the things that Louisa May grew up with, and was often scolded for being too loud, not feminine enough. Her dad was very fair. She had a darker complexion and darker hair. She was not like a little quiet little woman. She was someone who ran, and in fact, When she was 6, she ran away, and they found her sleeping on a dog on the port. And this is, so they tied her to a couch so that she would not run away. But this is the sort of spirit that she had. Biographer Martha Sexton wrote how Louisa's mother clung to her daughter, confiding in her the disappointment and hurt she felt and her mistrust of men. And although Louisa chose to destroy many of her journal entries before her death, the pictures of her relationship with her father were shown to be feelings of inadequacy. And she felt that her father did not find goodness in her person. And so the times that she grew up with were at times of immense change. She had examples like Margaret Fuller and Elizabeth Peabody. And in that time, a woman's place was supposed to be in the home, to be seen as delicate and in need of protection. Louisa was not that woman. She needed to find her own way. And it was an impression that would last a lifetime. She chose not to depend on society or men to provide for her or to be subjected to the constraints of marriage or motherhood. And one writer that I came upon while researching this said that if Louisa May Alcott had been born in a traditional family, we might not have had this gem of a person. And it made me wonder, what is it that shapes us? The times we grow up in. I know a lot of people who grew up who were active in the 60s were very much shaped by that time. And I have to think that Louisa May Alcott was also shaped by this very time of transformational change in society and this weird upbringing that she had with her father and just all that happened. And she said, Louisa said, I like to help women help themselves, as that is, in my opinion, the best way to settle the woman question. Whatever we can do and do well, we have a right to. And I don't think anyone will deny us. But so she was not to be messed with. And so she was described as a true daughter of Concord, a dutiful child of the high priest of Transcendentalism. This is older language. A young companion of Thoreau, the devoted disciple of Emerson. And she also says, with the raising of feminine consciousness, Alcott is increasingly seen as not only occupying this pedestal of true womanhood, but being a professional woman and serving an important role model for young women at the time with advocacy, abolition, and suffrage movement. I really like this quote from Louisa May. She said, "I am not afraid of storms, for I am learning how to sail my ship." And so she had a lot coming out her. She learned to buck what society told her that she could do. She lived in a very poor family, and she wrote a book in 3 months. I am so freaking jealous. I mean, I forget how many works she did. She did over 200 published works or something like that. She was prolific. And she felt the profound burden of caring for her family. I love that she created what's called pot boilers. That's what Allison was talking about earlier. And pot boilers is slang for an inferior story that is sold purely for profit. And, these like, ooh la la, ideas of women, but they were strong. And they weren't just like, oh, come save me, Beauregard. It was more like, I am the woman, and you are going to join me, and we will be equals. And you can look at Little Women and look at Laurie as a romantic figure. He talks to the girls. He wants to be friends with the girls. And the two marriages that happen are equal marriages. Jo marries her German tutor friend, and the younger daughter marries Laurie, who treats her as a person in and of her own right. which is pretty extraordinary for that time. Louisa May wrote one of the first fantasy novels in America called Flower Fables, and it was dedicated to Ralph Waldo Emerson's daughter, Ellen Emerson. And I really love that during the Civil War, she, instead of her dad, she's like, I'm gonna go make a difference. And she went and she actually worked with Dorothy Dix, who was another Unitarian who worked on reform and tried to change things with the Red Cross. And as you heard, she was treated, unfortunately, for typhoid fever with mercury, which is something that, is not good for your body. And ever since that time, she was never completely well. And from her experience in the Civil War, she wrote something called Hospital Sketches, and that was her first real experience with death, with bodies and being up close and intimate with men that, you didn't do that as a woman of that time, but she was binding wounds, she was sitting with people at their bedsides. And I think that really changed her. I think intellectually she knew that she was strong, but as we know, wartime, and especially the Civil War, was, the conditions were brutal. And I really feel like that shifted her character in a way that really made her feel her own power. And so when she was approached about writing Little Women, she didn't want to at first, but it was an immediate success. And she wrote in her journal, I paid up all the debts, thank the Lord. And she followed the women's success with 2 sequels after that. And, in Louisa's diaries, she recounted being in bed for months at a time. And then she would write manically, she would, and so it's possible that she may have been bipolar or suffered just from the ups and downs of health. And her need to perform and to support her family she was so driven. When she had so much money, she kept on writing. It was like this fire in her spirit to make a difference and to say, women have worth. Women can make a difference. We can all make a difference. We should speak to children like we speak to adults. And she eventually ended up adopting her niece after her sister May died unexpectedly. And so she served the role of Papa. Sometimes she would call herself Papa, because she was pretty much the father of her family in a lot of ways. By supporting, she fulfilled the role of mother with this, without ever marrying. And she was writer and philosopher, nurse, and just think of how many lifetimes she lived in her life. And so when I think about the wonder of someone like this, there is something in us that we have dreams. And she had a dream to write. She had a dream to be experienced as a person. And I think many UUs, many people who care about progressive causes understand that need to be seen and heard. And at that time, women were not seen and heard. They were not in a pulpit like this or in the halls of government. And so she blazed away. So I'd like to say where one person saw limitations, she saw opportunity to strive, scrap, and fight for a place at the table. These are a few words of advice from Louisa. She said, keep regular hours for work and play. Make each day both useful and pleasant, and prove that you understand the worth of time by employing it well. Then youth will be delightful, old age will bring few regrets, and life will be a beautiful success. She also said, simple, genuine goodness is the best capital to found the business of this life upon. It lasts when fame and money fail. and it is the only riches that we can take out of the world with us. And so many people have written about Louisa May Alcott. You know, there's been adaptations of Little Women for musicals and plays and operas. But what I found really neat was a lady wrote a book called Miss Alcott's Email. And and she wrote as if Louisa May Alcott was responding to her. And she explored what reform would mean and what ideas would happen. And the very last letter that she wrote to was a final letter to Alcott. And she said, "What I really like about you," to Louisa, "I have learned from you is that it is worth the trouble to work hard to make your life into something. You have acted in the world as if you matter, as if you can make a difference. In your case, it turned out to be true. You have made a difference. But a person never knows for sure. Your trick, your lesson is just a start. And that is what I will take with me into whatever future I have." So thank you, Louisa May Alcott, for teaching us to take chances and to make a difference. Amen.